Well, hello, everyone. So excited to have you. Thank you so much for tuning in to this webinar entitled Homogeneous Church Transitions. My name is Santis Beatty, and I direct the Office of Multi-Ethnic Ministries within the Office of Church Multiplication and Discipleship for the Wesleyan Church. And I am so excited that you joined us. We have an amazing lineup of panelists who are going to just speak from their experience. These are people who are out in the field, who have been tested and have work through this issue with a local church, and some even outside of their local church and other organizations. And so they are great resources for us here as well as for you. Now, I must say to you, part of the goal of these webinars is we believe that leaders are learners. And at the point we stop learning is at the point we stop leading. And so it's so important that we have moments like these where iron can sharpen iron. We can learn from each other. We can grow together. Now, here's the thing, like this, you'll hear from several panelists, and this is no prescription for your church, right? Every church is different, every context is different, but we do believe you might be able to glean something from what is shared today that you might be able to take back to your team, take back to your context, and it might be a blessing to your church. So there are a couple people that I want to introduce to you before we jump into our panelists, and one of them is really important to us. Her name is Josemar Trent. She's going to talk a little bit more about just how you can engage in this conversation from where you are. Josemar.
My name is Josemar Trent, and I'm the support staff as well as the translation specialist here for Church Multiplication and Discipleship. And we love the Zoom webinar because it allows us to interact with each other. So you will hear from our panelists today, and then at the bottom of your screen, you have the Q&A as well as the chat little icon right there, and then you can fill your questions to them. After each presenter has talked, we will ask them a few questions, but most of the questions will also be asked at the end of each presentation. So just make sure that you just type your questions there, and then we will ask them.
So we do want to hear from you, right? It's so important that you engage in this process, that you ask questions. No question is a dumb question. Every question is an important question. We're all learning. We're all learning as we go through this. So with that in mind, I want to turn to our first panelist. His name is Jason Borges. Jason has an amazing story. He's out in California doing some great work. I had a chance to visit his church a few times and just excited to have him on this webinar. So Jason, why don't you share a little bit of your story and a little bit of just the process and some of the steps you guys have taken at Antioch and share with this group. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me, and God bless everybody. How you doing? I'm Jason Borges. I'm a pastor in Antioch, California. It's about 35 minutes east of Oakland, so kind of Northern California Bay Area. I grew up in Southern California though, and that's kind of where I got my calling and all that good stuff. I was in college and started working with InterVarsity Christian Fellowship, and they asked me to go on a missions trip and do an urban project, and I didn't know any better, so I went. And I lived downtown San Diego and working with the homeless population for about 3 months. And that was my first missions experience. And I feel like I've been on mission ever since. So what happened in church after that is I became a minister at a predominantly Black Pentecostal church. And that was a growing up experience for me. I appreciated that. And because of my experience in missions and at that church, everywhere I went after that, even when I graduated college, people would tell me, hey, can you work with difficult populations, being homeless populations, be it gang and drug prevention, anything like that. I worked in a number of fields, all because of my church experience working downtown San Diego and Barrio Logan and some other places. So that's kind of how I started. And I didn't realize I was starting ministry or mission, but that's kind of how it happened. And then I ended up at a multi-ethnic Wesleyan church in Vista, California with Ed Garcia. And now I'm in Northern California at a predominantly homogeneous white church with, my wife and kids who are not white, and we're hanging out and enjoying ourselves. So to give you a little background on what's happened here at Antioch, I just want to say first off that when they asked me to come, they asked me if I could work in an area that was increasingly diverse, and the church was not. So the schools and the economy, everything is starting to shift to be kind of in between Stockton, Oakland. I don't know if you're familiar with those two cities or not, but everything is kind of pushing towards the middle, and people are moving in and out, back and forth. So we have you know, when the people that go to my church, when they grew up in this town, it was about 80-90% white. And now the school system, the kids and the youth in the community, it's about 50% Latino in the schools and about probably 25 to 30% African American, and then a mix of a whole bunch of other different things. So our youth are extremely diverse, but our aging churches in the area, not just ours, we're predominantly homogeneous. So I didn't come in and tell them we're just going to go multi-ethnic. I just kind of snuck it in there a little bit on them, but that's kind of how I do it. When they ask me about it, I tell them, but if not, we just do church, because my perspective is that we're going to give the gospel to whoever's around us, and that's who's around us. So what we did initially was my wife and I got settled in. Obviously, we've been here 3.5 years or so. And then what I started doing was looking at what the opportunities were to reach out to the community, to invite people to church. And so the biggest inroads that God gave us were through schools. So right now we have a program called Kids Club, where we're actually at a public school, and we have church once a week, right after school on Wednesday. And actually my wife's a reading teacher at that school, so we meet in her room, and we know the principal and all that good stuff. So, but that outreach and that church service with, you know, mostly elementary school kids is probably 50% Latino, another 30% African American, and the rest Asian, maybe a few sprinkled with a few Caucasian folks. So that experience is not what we see on Sunday morning. And I know Santiz was saying that we want to share, just be authentic about, you know, where we're at. Our Sunday morning experience, although this past Sunday we were at the 20% threshold for, you know, multi-ethnic attendance, but it doesn't feel all the time like it's multi-ethnic, even when we meet that. So that's a challenge for me right now. Trying to say, okay, how can we incorporate more? Matter of fact, last week we didn't meet that threshold, but we had 2 of our Hawaiian sisters were helping us with praise and worship, and we did a whole multi-ethnic thing. But the folks that showed up, you know, we didn't meet that threshold, like I said. So it's a challenge week in, week out for us. Half the time we're at that, half the time we're not. But most of the stuff we do in the community has been very much multi-ethnic focused, because that's what the community is. We don't even have to look for it. We don't have to, you know, stamp it or say, hey, everybody, let's do something multi-ethnic. When we just do something community driven, that's what it looks like. So the other thing that I want to say that God's really done for us has been, he's opened the door for us at the school district, not just at that one location, but when Antioch Unified School District or Antioch Police Department, when they do things that are stakeholder driven or community driven, they ask us to be a part of it. And I tell the church that it's us, even though I'm the one going, you know, it's all of us being a part of that. And so they have asked us to be a part of how do they reach out to this changing population, because their staff has been predominantly white for 20, 30 years. And so I'm in interview panels with the school district when HR is trying to say, hey, we want to go after quality people that are diverse and can relate with our kids and really do that. And I didn't give you a lot of background earlier, but for about 12 years, I ran a gang and drug prevention program in Oceanside, California, where I did that very thing with predominantly Asian Pacific Islander and Latino students. So I know how to do that. And so my church allows me to go in and do those kind of outreach opportunities. So my advice, if I had any, would be to make sure that those in your church that have some background in this, that you allow them some space and some time to do a lot of outreach. And I guess the last thing I would say would be about missions. When our church really started going to being intentional about linguistically being diverse, or even talking about multi-ethnic issues, it made it really easy for us to be on mission, whether it's global or local. And our local mission is obviously in the school districts and working with kids. But globally, you know, we're going on our first mission trip as a group, as a team. We're going to Mexico through my old college, Azusa Pacific. We're going down and doing some good work down there. And so that gives us opportunity to sing a few songs in Spanish and to say, hey, we're doing this, prepare these young people to go and let's send them as a church to be about this mission. So the church itself feels like we are doing this, even the folks that aren't able to go physically or financially. We're doing this as a group, as a team. And so we get to sing together, we get to pray together. It's a bonding experience. And also one of the other major ministries we have is called Dress a Girl, where some of our older, mostly white ladies are sitting around sewing once a month, and they sell these little dresses and send them all around the world to these little girls in like human trafficking spots. And they have little logos on them that have shown, like, if people are looking to traffic kids, they'll leave those kids alone because they look like they're affiliated with a group or an organization. So we just love girls, and we have ladies that like to sew. So my wife's sewn a dress, and my daughter, my oldest daughter, sewn a dress and sent them all over the Philippines and to Africa, all these places. And when we get pictures back, obviously most of those kids, I mean, they're just cute as can be, and we just love them and pray for them, and they're just the family of God. So we're not thinking it like, oh, we're going to send this to a multi-ethnic place. We're just going, you know what, we just love kids and we love people. And it's really easy biblically for us because we live in Antioch. So if you know anything about the book Acts in Antioch, you know, I just preached right from that passage, and that's where it started to be. You know, all these Gentiles didn't get the word yet, they didn't get the gospel. So let's go do it. It's in our heritage. It's in the name of our city, in the name of our church. So, so that's where we're at right now. Still trying to get Sunday to feel like when people come in and visit, that they're welcome there no matter who they are. And there've been a few times we had people come from Kids Club that spoke primarily Spanish, so it was a little rough for them. So we only have like 3 or 4 people in church that speak Spanish, and I can't really speak Spanish to them in my broken kindergarten Spanish when I'm preaching, although I'll throw a few words in here, and I just love it because half the congregation is like, what did that guy just say? I didn't even know he spoke Spanish. So anyway, we have that kind of dynamic right now, and we're looking forward to God doing more and more in that, especially after this Mexico trip in a few months. But thank you for listening to me, and I'll keep my pastor minutes short, which is rough for pastors if you know anything about that. So amen, and God bless you.
Hey, great to have you, man. Thank you so much. I love the story you shared just about, and we hear this often, that sometimes one of the best places to start this is in local schools, right? Like, people care about students, they care about families, and so, man, if there's one of the places you can start as you start thinking about not just diversifying your church, but meeting the needs of your community, one of the best places to start is with children, and to start with schools and build those relationships, and those relationships then turn into partnerships, and sometimes those partnerships actually turn into people becoming a part of your church, becoming a part of your leadership. So yeah, great story about what you're doing, man. So excited about the work there. So we're going to move to our next panelist, and really excited about her being able to join us. Some of you may know this, but she's one of the co-authors of one of the resources that we've been using called Multi-Ethnic Conversations. It was previously called the Multi-Ethnic Christian Life Primer, and her name is Onia, and she's at People's Church in Cincinnati. Onia, why don't you share a little bit of just a fascinating story of how at People's Church you all made the transition, and some of the steps that you all are taking right now.
Hi, Santis, and hi, everybody. I came to this work based on my seminary experience. I was writing a paper about the church, and I thought that it was our political divisions that were causing so much separation in the church. And that's where I came to Michael Emerson's and Christian Smith's work, Divided by Faith, and came to realize that it was our divisions in the church that were causing divisions in broader society. And so as a result of that, I've been passionate about this work ever since. And People's Church has been an amazing place for me to be doing this work and helping churches to become multi-ethnic. People's Church was in 1999 a 98% white commuter church that is in Uptown, which is more of an urban area of our city. But most of the people coming to the church were from the suburbs. So they would drive in on Sunday morning, come to church together, and drive out without having any impact in the city. Around 2000, our lead pastor, Chris Beard, got a vision that our church was supposed to be multi-ethnic, every tribe, tongue, and nation coming together. And the very first thing that he did about that was not to do anything with the church, but to do things with his own life. I want to say that it was Derwin Gray who first said it, so I want to attribute things correctly, but we often say you can't have a multi-ethnic church unless you live a multi-ethnic life. And so for any pastor, I would say it really starts with diversifying your personal networks. Who do you hang out with? Who do you play golf with on the weekend? Who do you go to the movies with? Those people need to be diverse in order for you to lead a church from an authentic place. And so the first thing he did was starting to have meetings with different pastors, especially pastors of historically African-American churches around the city. It was from those relationships that the second step really happened, and that second step was diversifying our leadership. So one of those pastors he had built relationship with in the year 2001 came to him and said, I'm tired of senior pastoring right now and I need a break. I'd like to step down for a while. Can I come be one of your associate pastors? And that was the first time at our church we had an associate pastor of color. So out of those relationships, we were able to diversify our leadership. Once we diversified our leadership, people saw that we were serious about wanting to move forward in this multi-ethnic vision and were wanting to come and be a part of our church. That happened not incidentally at the time that Cincinnati was having unrest over the shooting of an unarmed Black man within our city. So it happened that same week that the city was on lockdown because of unrest. We were able to make that hire into our church. My husband and I actually showed up at the church in 2004. So the church had been going through that process for a couple of years. And at that time is really where we began our next phase in the process, which I call tearing down idols. One of the big things that we had to deal with as a church was having a theology about America and how important our country is, and not, again, that we don't love the country, but that was getting in the way of bringing in and welcoming every nation because we were emphasizing one country over another. And so that might not be the thing that is causing divisions in your context, but what I would say is looking for the things that are non-essentials, that are getting in the way of the gospel, and taking out those barriers to other people coming and other people feeling included as part of the body is what we had to do around 2004. Then in 2005, we developed an experience that we called the Vision Experience. The next thing that was important was we, by then, because of the relationships of our pastor, because of our diverse leadership, because of us being willing to get rid of the non-essentials in order to welcome everybody in, we had started to have a church that really was looking diverse. But the problem was people were not doing life together. People would come in on Sunday morning and they would be willing to sit around together, even say hi to each other, provided there wasn't too much of a language barrier. But in terms of their life and their networks being diversified, that wasn't happening yet. So what we put together in 2005, myself and a group of other people, was called the Vision Experience. And basically what we did was we shut down all of the small groups, all of the classes at our church, and we said every single adult in our church needs to go through this together. And what it was 20 weeks of us getting down deep into our life experiences, to our stories, to understandings about race and ethnicity and culture that we hadn't been able to do as a group. What that did was it gave us a common language, and it gave us the beginnings, the buds of some relationships. And so we still have people to this day who are part of our church who say, I would not have stayed if it weren't for that experience. Santis mentioned earlier the book, Multi-Ethnic Conversations, and that is actually a direct result of the work that we did on the Vision Experience. We took it from 20 weeks down to 8 weeks, which is more of a modern length, and we're able to distill some of the things that we learned together in order to have other churches be able to have that experience as well. So in 2005 is where we really started to go deep with each other. We've continued to do that regularly. Our part of our new member process is we want people to go through a multi-ethnic conversations group as they become on as members. So we make sure that we're renewing and refreshing that. We've also done experiences around socioeconomic class, because part of being a multi-ethnic church is also being a socioeconomically diverse church. And I think the final thing that I would say that we've really tried to do is we've tried to iterate this process. So we've done something called the listening sessions, where we've had our diverse groups of people in the church. We divided it into 6 major groups, knowing that these groups are not monolithic, but it just gave us a starting point. We've talked with our East Africans, our West Africans, our Latinos and Latinas, our Asian Americans, and our African Americans, and our whites. And we had a diverse listening team listen to these groups of people and say, okay, hey, what do you like about your experience at People's Church? What don't you like about the experience? How could we go deeper in reflecting your culture? So taking the time to listen to the groups of people at our church and iterate on what it is that we're doing to make sure that we really are including everybody, and we're including everybody on an equal basis. As was said earlier, we're not there yet. I don't think you've ever arrived at this journey. But the fact that our population of our church now really does reflect the population in greater Cincinnati. We are thrilled and humbled and thankful about. And some of the things that we're continuing to work on bridging gaps with our international populations. We do currently have 2 language services. So figuring out how to continue making that one church. They are members, we are all members of one church, but how to make sure that we're developing those relationships, even with people who English is not their first or primary language. And then continuing to make sure that our leadership is reflecting that equality that we want to make sure that we have, moving from just inclusion to making racial equity really a principle of how we operate things, because that is what is unique and different from the way the rest of the society operates. So that's a little bit about our story.
You know, one of the fascinating things you mentioned was, and I know, you know, when I heard it the first time, I'm sure it may be similar how other people heard it. Like, you took your church through a series that long on diversity. And so the question comes like, how did you do that? Like, in terms of, how did you cast vision for that? Did you start with a smaller group convincing them, or did you just, was it a sermon series? Like, what initiated a deep dive, right? Like you took a deep dive, and some people would be afraid of doing that. One, because it's so long, and 2, because of the content. And how do we even train people to have these kind of conversations? So my question to you is, like, what was the process behind the before you launched it, and what was the pushback, and how did you respond to that?
So I guess by that time, we'd had about 5 years of working with the board, and the board gets elected every year, so it wasn't the same members, but the same leadership team of our church, of casting this vision that we are going to be multi-ethnic. This is the direction that we're going in, that this is why it's biblical. Always casting vision from the scripture, I think, has been key to our transition. So we had a leadership team that was engaged, on board. They didn't always know what it was going to mean, but there was no pocket of resistance, so to speak, that members could go to and feel like, I've got somebody on my side. So that was very important. The second thing we did was we took some of that leadership team and we put them on this group of people. And the group of people who put together the experience, we met together as a multi-ethnic team for, I think, about 6 months before we put anything out. So we spent intentional time building relationships and saying, this is what we want for our body. Let's model it ourselves first. It's always modeling it ourselves first, what we want for the rest of the group. Then after that, we trained facilitators. It doesn't have to be extensive training, but again, you just want to make sure that people understand what they're working with. And then we really did cast vision from the pulpit. So it has to be the senior pastor doing this. It has to be, it doesn't have to be, but we preferred saying it's everybody in. Because what can happen oftentimes is if you allow people to opt in or opt out, the people who are really already convinced will opt in, and the people who just don't want to engage in it will opt out. And we had a sermon series around it. Now, the sermon series wasn't the whole 20 weeks. That would have been a bit much, but we had a 3-week sermon series that kicked off the vision experience, which was a small group experience. And then we allowed that to continue from there.
So I love what you're saying, and I had a chance to visit your church. You had a conference. You have your church is a part of a city cohort with Mosaics, and so you guys had a One Humanity conference, which actually I want you to talk about a little bit later. I think you have one coming later this year. But one of the things that I'll never forget, your pastor Chris Beard, who's a good friend, he said that it's kind of a mantra at your church, and I hope I'm getting it right, but it basically says, at least 20% of the time, if not more, you're probably going to experience something in this church that you don't connect with, that maybe you don't like, and maybe you don't understand. And that is like a part of the DNA of your church, is helping people to understand that what we're doing, we're not just doing for you, we're doing so that everyone feels included, everyone feels involved, everyone's a part of the worship experience. Like, how did you do that? Like, how did you cast vision for that? Like, is that something that is now a part of everybody's way of thinking who's a part of the leadership? talk briefly about that, and we'll move. But I'd love to hear you talk about that.
Yeah, we call it the rule of 70, and it's 70% of the things that you are here for, you will enjoy, you will love. The things that you don't enjoy and love, that's part of somebody else's 70%. But even with that, I've heard pushback to that and saying, well, why wouldn't I go to a church where I get 100% of what I like? And that's a discipleship issue. But the thing that I tell people is to be encouraging is that eventually you will like 100% of what's here, because you will fall so much in love with your brothers and sisters that their 30% becomes your 30% as well, because you love them and you want them to have what they need. What we say in shorthand around people's churches, get comfortable with being uncomfortable, because it's part of the experience. And I know sometimes people want to put on their spiritual pajamas, but if we're all uncomfortable together, isn't that a form of comfort?
I think part of what you're talking about, right, is this process, this work is about living in tension, right?
Yeah.
It's not, we don't resolve this. Like, this is actually something that gives us a growing edge, that takes our relationships deeper, because oftentimes in that tension, we're rubbing against each other just in terms of what we like and don't like, what we're comfortable with, what we're not comfortable with. And I love, I can't remember who said it, but I remember it being said that one of the myths about this work is that people often think the better you get at this, the less conflict you have. And the reality is the better you get at this, the more conflict you have, but actually that conflict becomes a means of grace. It becomes a means of grace of getting beneath the surface of relationships, getting beneath the surface of issues, and really digging into what's really important, what's really valuable, which is our theology, our ecclesiology, and our ability to connect with people and meet needs. And so you all are doing that. I know you said you haven't arrived, but having gone to People's Church and seeing you all at work, you're definitely one of the models of how this can be done across the nation, across North America. So thank you for being a part of this conversation. I'm going to move to our next panelist, Jonathan Lewis, and he is someone who has a great story about this, not just from a pastoral standpoint, but now as a district superintendent within the Wesleyan Church. He's actually my DS right now, and someone that I love to work with on a regular basis and having these conversations. So Jonathan, why don't you share a little bit of your journey, a little bit of your story, and a little bit of your current context and your pastoral context, so that folks here can learn a little bit more about you.
I, about 12 years ago, 11 and a half years ago, became pastor of Christ Wesleyan in Greensboro. And it, at that time, was a, it was a all-white church and a 100-year-old church, and well established in the community, and a church whose look is very colonial, with the white columns out front and the high steeple in the community and all of that. And yet the community around it had changed drastically over those years. The culture on the inside had not changed. Culture on the outside had changed drastically. And so as coming in as a new pastor, I began to really spend a lot of time trying to pray and seek the Lord about what the vision, what kind of direction we should take. And I personally have always, my affinity has always been toward a more multicultural spirit. My wife is Latina. I've been involved in mission trips throughout my ministry. I've always, wherever I've been involved in some level of multicultural and racial reconciliation kind of activity, but it's all been more personal, not so much driven or worked its way into the fabric of the church. And so I'm praying, asking the Lord to help us discover what our vision is going to be. And along the way, I stumbled on a article in Outreach magazine, and the article told a story. And I'll try to give it in a very concise version, but basically, is a man who owned a business whose community changed around the business. And over the years, what he found himself was that many weekends he was being called by the local police to tell him that his business was being broken into. And finally, he found himself one night sitting in the back of his truck with a rifle across his lap, saying, in his mind, I'm going to protect my business. And in that moment, the Lord just spoke to him and said, you know, what are you doing? If you will love your community, I'll take care of your business. And so that began for him. He put away his rifle and bought up a bunch of basketballs and footballs, and he just started writing on the basketballs and footballs, I love you with the love of Jesus Christ. And he would throw those over the fence to the housing community that had grown up around his business. And that began a process of building relationships with the kids, that began a process of building relationships with the families. Ultimately, long story short, his business became a community center where kids came for after school programs, and many of those kids went on to college and all of those kinds of things. And when I'm reading that, you know, I've sensed the Lord telling me, if you will love this community, I'll take care of your church. And so that began a process for us. And as we looked around in our community, at that time, there's a major high school across the street from us that had 40 different nations represented in that high school. So if we were going to love our community, and those people of the community were going to come to our church, we needed to begin to think seriously about what it would be, what it would look like if we began to reflect that community. So that just began the exciting part of our journey, and beginning to see that transition of loving our community. And we began doing all kinds of partnerships. We did food programs, and we partnered with our schools. We were present in the elementary school, where I was known as Pastor Jay, and I loved walking through the schools, and kids and teachers alike knowing me on that level. We began food programs that connected us with other people within the community. We began partnering with other African American churches in the area, and that just created just powerful worship experiences in the early stages of this journey, because it gave our people an understanding of what this would feel like. Is if this was to keep moving forward, how would this feel? How would we enjoy this kind of experience? And that began to plant some seeds. And in fact, one of the things that we did is, one of those pastors that we had partnered with went out on a sabbatical. He had a small church of about 50 or 60 people, and they literally came and worshiped with us. During those 6 weeks, we did a mini merge and merged our churches together. During those 6 weeks while he was away on sabbatical, I just became the spiritual caregiver for his church, and he trusted me on that level, and that was just an amazing experience. And then we began to work with the children of the apartment complexes in our school, in our area. That was the next step of going deeper into connection on a cultural and a really relationship building level, because we found that if you want to find the places where multi-ethnic ministry can thrive, find an apartment complex, because there are people literally from all over the world. And so we began working with a apartment complex, kind of adopting that, and then those children would move to another apartment complex, and their parents would call us saying, hey, if you can, could you come pick us up at this apartment complex? We've moved. Well, we would go there, and this week it's those kids. By the time we came back the next week to pick up those kids, it was those plus 5 more. And so this connection with about 3 different main apartment complexes that were pretty rough areas in our immediate community. And so we were present in those communities doing things on a regular basis. One of the other things that we did during that time was began to open up our church to outside events. And so people started calling, or had been even, but started calling even more to have special events like weddings at our church, because it's such a traditional looking church. And so they might have been people that had their own church somewhere else, but their church was a more contemporary warehouse kind of look, and we had the traditional look. And so they wanted to get married at our church or have concerts at our church. And oddly enough, most of those were African Americans that were doing that. And so after these events, naturally, people were riding by on this busy road, seeing African American people flood in and out of our church. And it got to the point where people wondered, okay, is that a black church? Is it a white church? And we even had one lady from our community come to the church and on a Wednesday night, and she's walking around and she was thinking, man, there are a lot of white people that attend this black church, because she had just seen these events taking place. But so all of this fed into one person after another, one family after another becoming a part of the church, and ultimately through our sports program, we began an upward sports program, and that too began to bring some families in. And so ultimately that led to one of the major challenges in this journey, and the next step in that was hiring staff. And we were able to hire our first African American staff member, and so that again began to solidify, the importance that we had in this journey. That it was not just a feel-good kind of thing because of who happened to be the pastor, but that it was a part of our family. This is DNA. This is who we are, and so those are major steps in the journey. Probably the biggest step in the journey was when I began to transition out, because then they had to decide, the people from within had to decide, okay, is this who we are, or is this just because we happen to have a pastor whose affinity is toward this? And that for me, that was the most gut-wrenching side of this, because I had to back away. I mean, I couldn't have personal influence in how they sorted through that. And I'm just so thankful that Pastor Ken, who followed me, and the people who he has brought around him, and Pastor Santise, being a part of that process as well, has just really helped that remain a part of the DNA of the church. So that's been our journey, and now I get to help other pastors who have that same sense of calling and a vision to begin to process that journey themselves.
Love it. Thank you, Jonathan. Great stuff, man. This question might be a question that I would ask for everyone at the end, but I'll ask it of you now, and then folks can think about how they would respond. But how did you deal with the pushback? Because my guess is, and I think I've gathered from being there, and I think this is the story of almost everyone on this panel, that when you started making this move, people left, right? Or people began, the knock at the door of, I don't know, Pastor Jonathan, if this is really what I bargained for. Like, how did you deal with the pushback? How did you deal with people who were either threatened to leave or actually left? Like, what was your process of communicating with them, or communicating with your team, and dealing with that with the congregation who's watching, family members, or maybe even good friends who've been a part of the congregation for a while, and maybe even leaders walk away from the church because of this commitment? How did you deal with that pushback?
Dealt with that all along the way, and it was part of my teaching and part of our vision. I tried early on to help shape the terminology that we use, especially as children first began to come into the ministry through our Wednesday night outreach time. And like Jason mentioned, our Wednesday night time initially was very different. That was our multi-ethnic ministry. It didn't reflect itself on Sunday morning. And so there was a kind of a temptation, or at least a trend, of people referring to our children that would come in, and children and teens that would come in from the community. They would call those the bus kids or the community kids, as if those were different kids. And I began to just try to help them understand, no, these are our kids. And I would refer to our kids who happen to ride the bus, or our kids on Wednesday night, or our children, our teens. These are our apartment complexes. I tried to use everything I could from a terminology standpoint that enveloped them as part of the family. In fact, our first word of our vision statement was together. Before we even got to everything else, I want to emphasize the fact that we are together. They're part of they're ours. they're ours, and they're part of our family. And so I continually taught along those lines. The sad reality is that you are going to have those who will say, I'm with you, Pastor, but I can't go this far. And one of those major times is when we hired our assistant pastor. And in fact, he was on staff, so to speak, but a volunteer status, doing all the things that he was doing before as a volunteer. We literally, only thing that we started doing was paying him and gave him the title of assistant pastor. And there was an exodus because of that. And so we just had to, there are times you just have to swallow hard, and you realize, the things that are motivating, the reasons why people might not want to be a part of that kind of ministry, God's going to have to change that. And the only way that I can try to go after them is to back away from something that I think God has called us into. This is not just my affinity. This is God's call. And so I've got to choose, do I give in to these people or I give into the vision? And so I chose to stick with the vision. I feel like that's what God would honor, and that's what God had called us to do. And sometimes people would just have to find another place. I couldn't chase after them, because to do so would be to compromise my own sense of call. And so sometimes we just had to sadly bear that burden, but keep moving on, because I knew that this was where God was calling us to be.
That's great. That's great, Jonathan. I think part of it would be great to have introed this session with some theological underpinnings of this topic, to be able to dig into Matthew 28, to be able to dig into a Revelation 7:9, to be able to dig into 2 Corinthians 5. But we're not able to do that. And so part of the assumption is that we believe the people who are watching understand that this is not just an issue of diversity, it's actually an issue of discipleship. And if we take it even further with Matthew 28, it's an issue of multiplication. Jesus's great commission, that as you go, make disciples, right, of all nations. And then we talk about the going, we talk about the making disciples, but we don't always talk about the all nations, And so we're assuming that people are coming in at some level, understanding that biblical mandate, understanding that this is discipleship, not diversity. But in case that's not the case, we want to mention it now, that this is sound theology, sound ecclesiology. It is laced all throughout the New Testament, and you see pictures of it even in the Old, and what we see with Abraham and what we see with the prophets, et cetera, et cetera. But thank you for sharing that, Jonathan. We're going to move to our next panelist. It's actually a couple, and they are out in South Dakota, and they lead an amazing ministry called Hasapa Ministries, or Hasapa Church. They have been a part of the Wesleyan Church for a number of years, both ordained and helped lead our native ministries, Wesleyan Native Ministries. And so Dale and Larry, why don't you just introduce yourself, tell a little bit about your story, and you guys probably have already coordinated how you're going to do that, but if you'll just share a little bit of your story and what's happening in Rapid City, South Dakota, that would be awesome.
Okay, my name is Larry Salway. I'm co-pastor with my wife Dale here in Rapid City, South Dakota. We're primarily a native church. My calling, I'm Lakota, and Dale has a little bit of Mohawk in her, and she's English and German, I believe it is. I think those are only two. Anyway, we were called here 11 years ago, back to Rapid City to pastor a native church. And when we got here, there was only 8 people in the church, and there was just 2 of them that were native. And so Dale and I started asking around and wondering, where are the Indians? You know, where are the Native Americans? And we spent that first year getting acquainted with the community, and then we spent a year on our faces, fasting and praying and seeking God, because I had never seen a successful Native church. I've seen a lot of churches that were started by missionaries, but they all come and went. And when I first got saved, there was 21 Wesleyan churches in South Dakota, New Mexico, New York, and Arizona. When I came back here 11 years ago, there was 1 or 3, 2 in Navajo, and then the one up here in South Dakota. So I wanted to know what we need to do to reach our people. That's when God showed us that we needed to have a church without walls, go out into the community. I'm a local, and so people know me. I'm related to so many people, tons and tons of them. And so as we started going out from our little chapel here and making connections, in the summer we take youth teams and do kids camps and sports camps and concerts. It was our way of outreach. At Christmas, we put together a native nativity scene, and we reached out into the community. We gave gifts. We sang Lakota hymns for them as English carols. It was our way of doing outreach, and God blessed it, and it was very successful. It got to the place where now we use the DVDs to reach out into the communities that we go to and to encourage the believers. Well, to make a long story short, you heard Santee say that, tell a little bit about it. He knows I don't know how to tell time, so. But several years ago, a couple of years ago, we had a tragic incident in our community in Rapid City. A couple of young Native boys were stopped by the police, and in line of questioning, they shot and killed 2 of the officers. One of the officers was killed, and the other was wounded quite a bit. They did eventually shoot him back, and that caused a great, there's already a racial divide here in Rapid City and across the reservations, across South Dakota, a very racist redneck community towards natives. And this intensified. All kinds of fear mongers began making allegations. And so with fear and trembling, Dale and I felt like we should have a prayer vigil for both sides of the victim and the perpetrator. And we did. We had the chief of police come, the mayor come, police come, community members, and the Native people came. There was about 150 people out. And all the village around us, Native people kept walking and looking. That was the first time that I heard the tribe say that a church really defended and stood by the natives when they lost someone. So that began our journey from doing outreach and then looking back into our own community, and then realizing that we had been so busy reaching out on the 7 reservations that we were neglecting Rapid City. And that began the inward journey for Dale and I personally. In Proverbs 31, 8 and 9, you know that, says that we're supposed to speak up for those that can't speak for themselves. We're to judge fairly. We're to defend the rights. And God is really concerned about the widows, the orphans, the aliens, and the poor and the needy. That began our journey in our church. And we began a building process to build a new church building. Was going to build it for 300. We thought, I've never seen in my life seen 300 Indians in one place except at a funeral or a powwow or a wake. But to come to church, no, they won't do that. But we went ahead and built, and God helped us by faith. That whole thing was completely built by faith. But now it is the center of the community. We're located in North Rapid City. There are over 80,000 population, and out of that 80,000, 20,000 are Native families. And of that 20,000 Native families, they are located in North Rapid. What an opportunity to have a lighthouse in the midst of the hood. I mean, where the drugs are rampant, where gangs are running, all of these things going on. And yet, in spite of that, God has helped us to be able to reach out into the community. And we realize that our transition period now for the whole church is to reach not only natives. I'm a native. Most of our people, 80% of them are natives, but we do have some Filipino families coming. We have some Latino families coming. We have some Black American families coming, and people are coming, and we want to build bridges. And I think the thing that, and I struggled with this, I thought, how will I, as a native man, reach out to a Filipino, to a Latino, to a white man? How will I reach out to them? And I think the thing that really changed my life completely was a Mosaic conference that I was allowed to go to and attend. I never saw so many people of color, denominations, race, creed, and color, and yet the anointing of the Holy Spirit was on every one of them. That really changed my outlook, and I realized that what you said in Matthew 28, that we're to make disciples of all nations. The Indian people, there's 530 nations, but think of all the other nations. And I think my wife will give you a little bit better understanding about what we've done from there.
Dale Salway and Larry and I co-pastored together at Has Happened New Life. It's been kind of a 3-year journey for Larry and I, as far as we have intentionally, as Larry mentioned, we have intentionally reached out to the Native American population, who historically and up to the present day have a very low percentage of Christians. And nationwide, the estimate is only 8 to 10% of Native Americans have accepted Christ. And in our area, the percentage is only, we guess, 1 to 2%. So we have intentionally focused on reaching these people, and God has blessed, and we've had a huge outreach, and we estimate many thousand have become saved, and they're on the journey of learning to accept Christ as their Savior at some level. But our community around our city in Rapid City is also rapidly changing. In the last 2 years, we have many Latino immigrants coming in, and also we've had a large Asian influx of people coming in our city has been very racially divided. It's been largely the white and the Native American. So now we see the shift in what our community looks like. And so it has caused us to change our perspective on how we think that we need to reach out into our city. And we've been praying with a new church building. We've been praying that God will give us a new vision for our city. And out of this is coming a more diverse congregation for our church. The MIE program that I'm just finishing through Indiana Wesleyan has also helped Larry and I both to open our eyes. One of the papers I had to write was how to start another service incorporating another ethnicity into our church. And so I chose to write about the Latino population, who I knew were present in our city in a small number, but we thought we would like to reach out to them. A lot of our Native people are intermarried. Well, a year and a half ago, providentially, God sent a multiracial couple to our church. They are a volunteer couple. Randy is part Native and white, largely white, and his wife is Filipino. She's a Filipino citizen. They had been ministering in the Philippines for 7 years, and then God had changed their focus and brought them to the U.S. through circumstances that they weren't really ready for that change. But through the circumstances, God brought them back to the United States, and they were looking for a place to minister. And lo and behold, God connected them to us. And his wife, Dina, is just a wonderful person, and she missed her culture. She missed her people. And so we told her there's a lot of Asians in our community. Through the Air Force Base, why don't you try to reach out? And then she started reaching out, joining the local social clubs. And through that process, we asked her to begin a Filipino group within our church. And so she has, and she has invited them to church, and they love our church. They starting to come in large numbers in our Wednesday night fellowships that we have for the women. They all come, and we share our ethnic foods back and forth, and it's been a great time. We're trying to encourage them to join our worship team, and so that we have their influence in our worship team and also in the decor of our building. And so our eyes have been opened a lot to other ethnicities in our city as well. And I made contact with the English as a second language director in our city. And she said that I have a meeting set up with her in a couple of weeks, but in my conversation, she said that the Latino population is becoming large within the last year in our city. And so we're trying to make connections and figure out how we can reach out to them. We have seen some Muslim neighbors on our street and in our mall, which is not too far away. And so we're actively making connections and seeking ways that we can make connections. As Larry has mentioned, and as I mentioned before, our city in Rapid City is very racially divided. And so we want to make sure that our church is a church that welcomes the others who may not necessarily be intentionally welcomed into our other churches of our city, but we want to make sure that our church is a church that intentionally welcomes everyone to our church.
Thank you so much, Dale and Larry. You know, I had a chance to come out and visit you all last year, and I was floored by what the community is doing in response to how you've opened your church. And I think it's a great example of what happens when we turn our face to prayer. We pray that God would open doors. We pray that God would give us access. And lo and behold, he does it. Sometimes he does it in ways we don't anticipate. You know, sometimes it's through tragedy that doors get open. Sometimes it's through relationships. People just pop up at our church services or pop up in our offices. But I was absolutely amazed at the doors that have been opened, that your church has become a community center. And what's amazing about it is you just finished your building, you just moved in late last year, and all of this is happening around the same time. And so it's just a great testament to those who are watching, that as you continue to pray and seek God's face, that he would open those doors. Watch out, he will answer your prayer. And it may be in a way that you don't expect, but be open to the possibilities of what he could do through relationships, through your church, through parachurch organizations, et cetera, et cetera. We're going to come back to something that you mentioned earlier a little bit later, just about the partnerships and some of the things you guys are doing. But I want to ask that question in the context of everyone else. So we're going to go to our last panelist, Kyle Ray, who is one of my former pastors up in Kentwood, Michigan, Kentwood Community Church. And just so excited that you're able to be on today, Kyle. Won't you just give us a little bit of a background of your story, how you came into the role that you're in, and some of the steps you all have taken at Kentwood?
So, I've had the privilege of sharing this story in a number of settings, and I'm thankful for the opportunity to share it today. And it's been good to hear so much from the other panelists, details of their stories that I didn't know before. The short version of my journey is that I got married to a woman that I fell in love with named Petra in Detroit. And in the midst of our engagement, we decided to relocate from Detroit to Grand Rapids, Michigan. So it's about 2 hours away. The reason we were moving was a job change. I was an engineer and she was in human resources. So we moved, and the one thing we needed to do together was find a church home. We found a church called Kentwood Community Church. We showed up one weekend. Long story short, we decided to stay. We met the pastor, a guy by the name of Wayne Schmidt, who serves as the general superintendent now for the Wesleyan Church. But at the time, he was the senior pastor of Kentwood Community Church. And in 1999, KCC was probably 99% white. And so we showed up in the fall of that year. We didn't realize that earlier in the year, in the month of June, Wayne had attended the high school graduation at East Kentwood High School, which is, less than a mile away from the church. And he said it felt like he was at a United Nations event because of so much diversity there. At the time, there were over 40 different languages spoken in homes of the students that attended there, over 40 different nations on birth certificates. And so what Wayne was already wrestling with before we showed up was why this church right down the street that had done so well in terms of growth and was about to celebrate 20 years and was over 2,000 people, why didn't it reflect the diversity in the surrounding community? Why was it not reaching some of these other people groups in the community, and why was he not even aware of that diversity? And so I think it was the year 2000, Divided by Faith came out. Wayne read that. And that was the first time KCC kind of formed a diversity committee. My wife was on that early committee. We were just attending at that point, and we started to get more involved and build friendships. At around the 3-year mark of our attending there, I sensed that God was calling me to go to seminary, so I went down to Asbury Theological Seminary. KCC was still on this journey. God had drawn in a few other folks. We were learning from some other churches along the way. But when I went away to seminary in 2003, Wayne was intentional about saying, hey, if you ever want to come back, there'll be a spot here on staff for you. Fast forward to 2005, I had a year left to go on my Master's of Divinity. I came back to hang out at KCC during the Global Leadership Summit that Willow Creek puts on. Bill Hybels was talking about a holy discontent when you're just, not happy with something and you feel like you have to take some action on it. And Wayne realized that his holy discontent had to do with this issue of the church still not reflecting the diversity in the surrounding community and us missing some people groups. He felt like God said, Wayne, are you really interested in reaching everyone in the surrounding community or just the folks that look like you? And so Wayne leaned over to me at that conference and said, hey, if you were to come back and join the staff here next year, you could help me, diversify the church. And I said, look, I'm not going to come and be your designated diversity pastor. That has to be in the heart of the senior leader. And so, we'll see where God takes that for you. And at that point, Wayne went on a personal journey, much like what Onia described with Pastor Chris Beard. He began to build cross-cultural relationships with pastors in the city. It became more personal for him at that point. It was no longer a delegated diversity journey. I came and joined the staff. I was the first African-American pastor on staff. And then fast forward to 2010, I actually followed Wayne and became the lead pastor at KCC. And so I've been in that role now for 7 years. And I would say our staff is more diverse than it's ever been. Our board is more diverse than it's been. And there's a lot that we've done through the years just to try and transition from a homogeneous church to multi-ethnic church. There have been a lot of lessons that we've been able to share in conference settings, and then there have been some hard things along the way, some things that have already been alluded to by other churches. We decided, for example, to not use any of the white Jesus images in our worship services on the weekend because we felt like it was culturally inaccurate. And so when movies like The Passion came out and people were excited about using clips from that to show in Easter services, we just chose not to. We'll show images of a Bible or the cross, but we've eliminated those kinds of images. If we use any videos for sermon illustrations, if it's dialogue with a group of people, but it's all one ethnic group, we won't use them. We try and use videos that have a diverse group of people. When it came to pictures on the wall, people coming back from missions trips, we didn't want pictures that only showed white people serving non-white folks in these kind of missions contexts. If we couldn't find good photos of a diverse group of people serving, or even the people that we partner with in a missions context doing the serving, then we just, we couldn't use those images. Staff-wise, we have probably had some component of cultural sensitivity or diversity training in just about every annual staff retreat for the last 12 years. And so it's just a constant reinforcement. Our staff are required within their first year to go through some kind of intercultural training. And I would just say, we found that it's been very easy to be intentional with the staff. It's always been harder to be more intentional with the congregation. I do know the story of what People's Church did and have often thought about, would we ever shut down every class and every group for that kind of purpose? We haven't taken that step yet. So I can keep talking, but, it's probably a good place to pause and and let you ask some questions.
Very good. Thank you, Kyle. So this question is for the entire group, and Kyle, you can chime in first if you'd like. But the question is, like, how do you handle? And I know this happened at KCC, and I venture to say it's happened at some level to all of our churches that are here. But how do you handle, like, one part of your church becoming multi-ethnic or becoming more diverse when the rest of the church hasn't? So, like, for example, for a lot of the churches like Christ Wesleyan, for example, it was the youth group, right? It was a youth group or the children's ministry. I think for Kentwood, it may have been in another area, and the high school ministry and middle school ministry was actually last to become diverse. So, like, how do you take one area that is becoming diverse, and how do you help cast vision for that becoming a reality in the other parts of the church? And then how do you deal with the tension of when that happens in that particular area of ministry? So we'll start with Kyle, and if there's others that want to jump in, feel free.
So, Santees, I would say that my view on it is still evolving. So years ago, yeah, we had our traditional student ministries that were majority white, and then we started kind of an after school component, reaching the middle school and high schoolers. It was like 95% African American. And so what we felt some tension about was, why can't we get the two groups to coexist, right? Why can't we see a better bridge between, that after school component and our more traditional youth group component? And eventually that became kind of a reason to end the after school component. There were some other reasons, but it was this thought of, we need our student ministry staff, because it was a different set of staff people. We need our student ministry staff to really get this. And so rather than having segregated youth group, then we just really need to work hard to integrate, the traditional youth group. Now, and so I would say that really hasn't worked. So now we're kind of back in a situation where we've started to let Young Life use our building on Wednesday evening. So our youth group for high schoolers meets on Sunday evening. Young Life hadn't had a presence in the local high school in many years, but they have restarted this great partnership with many pastors. But KCC is the host location for their after school club on Wednesday, and it's targeting high school students, and it's majority African American, and it's kids that don't necessarily feel connected in our Sunday night youth group. So I think I'm at a point now where we're taking a different approach and saying, okay, they need more men serving because they get mostly boys that come to Young Life. So is this an opportunity for us to really cast vision for some of the white males and also African American males and Latino males to come and step up and serve the crowd that's there? Even though we would love to see these kids come on Sunday night, it's an opportunity for some cross-cultural relationships to be built on Wednesday night. So.
Very good. Thanks, Kyle. How would you respond to that question? Or would you add anything to what Kyle just mentioned, just in terms of like, how do you respond in one area? Like, for example, some churches, it seems like they lean more in the worship area. So worship becomes the place where it happens, but the congregation hasn't changed, or for some it's staff, the staff becomes more diverse, but the congregation hasn't become more diverse, or the music hasn't become more diverse. So how do you handle, or have you seen this challenge in your context, and how do you take what might be the start of the transition and then help that to become a bridge to the other parts of your church or your leadership?
I'll jump in. One of the things, as I mentioned earlier, just had to do with creating those partnerships early on so that people could get a feel for what that worship experience might look and feel like as we would transition more into that. But the other just came as slowly but surely families started coming in, where they began to see this is not just about children and teens on a Wednesday night. When people actually began to see families walking through the doors, whether it be Hispanic or Asian or African American, that were coming straight out of the community, as a direct result of the ministry that was taking place on Wednesday night, then they began to see the big picture connection that it was more than just the children. And then ultimately what has helped kind of solidify that and take it to more than just a Wednesday night thing for children and teens is even as I was transitioning out, the focus began to really direct a lot of the ministry, a very intense ministry on a core group of teens, especially that had that true multi-ethnic reflection. And they were part of our real core group of teens. And so they began to really devote a lot of discipleship with them. And that will help them, I believe, solidify this perspective that this is their church, not just while they're a teen, but for as long as they're in that community, they'll know that this is my church. So I think those were some of the steps that we took along the way.
Thank you, Jonathan. So let me ask a second question that just came in. And maybe this is one of the questions I was going to pose to Dale and Larry earlier, but others can chime in on this as well. Like, the question is, like, how do you deal with the relationships as you're starting to form new relationships? And we get that label sometimes. Here comes that pastor. How do you build relationships that? And I think the way they framed the question, without it being confrontational or without there being kind of this understanding, particularly when it comes to schools or other things, that that barrier of faith. Like, are they going to be talking about Jesus all the time? How do we build relationships with people that are not in the faith community, given the fact that we are, and we have the gospel, we have this amazing message, we have people that we want to reach, but how do you build partnerships with people who are not a part of the faith community, whether they be schools or you mentioned the police department, et cetera, et cetera. So what are your steps to have this safe environment for people to build partnerships when they're not a part of the faith community?
In our situation, it's a little bit unique because when we took the initiative to invite the mayor and the chief of police, the first time we had a prayer vigil, and other people in the community, and we just asked different believers to put aside their differences and come together. And when they did, what the chief told us and what the tribal people told us, leaders told us, was that that's a safe place. You guys have a safe place where we can come. Because when we did this one where we had the chief and the mayor and the city officials and community leaders, the mayor and the chief of police stayed there and did not dodge the questions, real hard questions about shootings that had happened. They felt like they was under investigated when there was native, non-native, and native. And so what we did is we provided an environment where the elders in the community were allowed to express their anger and frustration, but the chief and the mayor answered the questions, and they didn't run, they didn't hide, they didn't evade. And in fact, it became, at first, it was so hostile that we knew that there was inappropriate actions that could have potentially taken place. But we prayed and fasted and prayed, and so the news media was there, the local TV, the statewide, the public broadcasting network was there, and they all asked an interview and asked, what is our purpose for this? What do we expect out of it? And it was just that what we said is make a safer place for our children. And somehow throughout the community, after that, we had another 2 prayer vigils, and we've met with there are 36 social agencies in Rapid City working on racial reconciliation. And so we're part of we hosted 2 meetings where these agencies come together in our church, and they're trying to find out why these racial divisions are ongoing. And to me, I think the city and the government officials and the community members realize that they can come to us, and I'm not going to press religion down their neck. I won't let anybody else speak. I try to control these meetings as tight as I could, and I'm a pretty big guy. And I'm elder, and so I'm respected a lot from the other people. And so we have just become known as the church that'll help you because they have a safe place. And the kids are realizing that, and the adults are realizing that very traditional people who have no one to speak out for them, we speak out for them. And so I'm sure there are a few who say, oh yeah, there's that Salway guy again, he's going to preach religion, but I don't. I try to establish we're building bridges with them. And if we can do that with the kids, with the adults, with the people in the community, I think we're doing it the right way. Provide a safe place for them. Honey, you got any more to add?
Well, the only other thing I would add, we've attended 2 recent prayer vigils at the scene of 2 local murders, and we were very much a part of that. In fact, we're partnering with another guy in the community he's from a different religious belief system, but he partners with us, and he asked Larry to lead the prayer in these prayer vigils. So that's one. And then I called the Immigrant Connection and getting some information on what the population for immigrants are in our city, and doing some research on that. And one of the suggestions that came out of that was to contact the English as a second language coordinator for our local school system. So we're reaching out through her. And when I told her that we were willing to assist the people who need help and asked her what the needs are, she was so ecstatic to have us seek to partnership with her. So that is just another beginning avenue where we're trying to build bridges and build partnerships.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you. I think, Kyle, you responded to this question to Amy on the chat. Would you share kind of what you said there? And then I want to come to a question for Onia right after that. So if you'll do that, Kyle, that'd be great.
Yeah, I just talked about the reality that many organizations are actually looking for the church to step up and help. So they see so many churches, but they wonder, what difference are you really making in the community? And so I often tell people, you'd be surprised if you show up in many school districts and say, hey, I'd like to just volunteer to read with kids who are struggling or have some learning challenges. They'll embrace you. They'll actually think that you dropped from heaven because they're always looking for help. And then I always tell people who kind of get all down and say, there's no more prayer in public schools, et cetera, et cetera. I say, you know what? If you go in and you volunteer at a school and you learn the names of the kids that you're working with, no one can stop you from praying for them, talking to God about them when you're on your own time. And then the reality is, if you run into them at the grocery store or the gas station and they're with their parents and they greet you by name, and their parent is wondering, how do you know my child? And you're able to say, I serve at their school. And you could even say, and I've been praying for them, and I've been praying for the opportunity to meet you, or I've been praying for your family even before I got to know you. The other thing I said in response to Amy was just, in our case, the mayor of our city happens to be a Christ follower. And so he had some initiatives that were really important to him, where he felt like it would be better if the church was working together. So he actually was the one that convened a pastor's gathering in our community where we didn't previously have one. And he felt like the Lord had given him a vision that, well, what if the church stepped up with respect to jail ministry? So really providing a way to minister to inmates. And then there was no Young Life presence at the high school. And so, he really spearheaded that. And that's where churches are working together on that, even though KCC is the host site. And then the Leadership Summit we host in partnership with Willow Creek. We are always inviting people to attend it, but when the mayor's casting vision that, hey, this is a great way to continue to grow as leaders, then that's been a great tool too for partnership. So we aren't seen necessarily as a church where people are saying, here comes that pastor. It's more like we're seeing as we're starting to be seen as a group of people who add value to the community. And as we do that and build relationships, we're able to open the door for some spiritual conversations.
Great, thank you, Kyle. So this next question came in, and I'm going to ask it directly of Ania, and others can chime in if you'd like. But the question was like, how do you, like, we have new people coming all the time, hopefully, prayerfully, right? And so you've done this work with your leaders, you've done this work with the congregation. Like, how do you incorporate new people? Like, how do you help people who are just starting to become a part of your church understand your vision, understand your DNA? Is there a regular rhythm that you do things? Like, how do you incorporate new people?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the most important things, and others have said it, is that this vision for a multi-ethnic church really has to come from senior leadership. So constantly on Sunday morning, we're working things into the sermons, into the ministry moments, into the illustrations that reflect who we are. I like to say somebody shouldn't be able to visit our church more than once and not know that part of our vision is to be racially reconciling. The second thing is that in our inclusion sessions, which is kind of our entryway where people who are newer to the church come to get connected and start to serve, they have a history of the church that walks people through our 114-year history, as well as the current changes to be diverse. So again, if you're deciding that you want to serve at our church, you're going to know about the DNA of our church. And then the next step when you're becoming a member, we have our multi-ethnic conversations class that goes on twice a year. So it's not a prerequisite to becoming a member, but before you are, before a year has passed from the time you become a member, we ask that you go through one of those groups. So we have people going through those groups all the time. So I'd say we try to make sure in the way that we reflect Sunday morning and in our process of incorporating people that we are constantly reinforcing these lessons that we've learned. But the thing that has been helpful is having a core group of people who have that DNA, and then they're transmitting it to everybody who walks through the door as they come in.
That's great stuff. So this next question is from a youth pastor who's, and maybe Jonathan, you can answer this because I think this is something that you've experienced at Christ Wesleyan and others can jump into. He's asking the question, Hunter is asking the question, like, okay, I have this multi-ethnic youth group, but then when they leave my youth group, they graduate and they go out, even within our church, it's pretty mono-ethnic, right? My church is, the adult group is mono-ethnic, or when they graduate and they leave my church and they go to a predominantly homogeneous church, you know, in their particular area, whether it be college or whatever. Like, how do you help? Let's start within the church first. Like, how do you create opportunities for those students who leave a diverse youth group and become a part of a predominantly homogeneous church, whether that be Black, white, Hispanic, Native, or Asian? Like, what are some things that you did at Christ Wesleyan to help students who were coming out of youth group into a predominantly white church?
Well, one of the things that we began to focus on quite a few years ago is that we realized that in our worship atmosphere, you know, we found that our children and teens, you know, they were just not connected, you know, because we were not having any real solid worship opportunity in that children and teen gathering. And so we just set a goal. We want to create worshipers of God. And so that developed into developing a worship atmosphere on the Wednesday night, which meant that finding teens and children even that played instruments and could sing and things like that. And so we began focusing on that, and probably up until this last year, and probably even more so today, even, that is entirely led by children and teens. There are a few adults that might pop in from time to time to help fill out instruments or fill out singing, but you know, children and teens are all serving in worship and aiding in that, and it's helped connect them. And then that that helped build the bridge into the Sunday morning worship experience, because now they're on a weekly basis. You can look up and see that the worship atmosphere on the platform is that multi-ethnic kind of reflection, because a lot of those have just literally been raised up through the children and teen ministry. They've been up there holding mics and singing, and so when the time came when they're older in their spiritual development and their years, they are now serving on a larger level. But it got its start right there in that teen atmosphere and children even atmosphere. So so that was one of the ways that we were going to build that. We wanted to build that bridge between it just being a Wednesday night experience and to becoming this is who we are in our church kind of experience.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you, Jonathan. So here's my last question, and then we're going to kind of give you some closing statements and just kind of send you out. So how do you get beyond, and this is for anybody, like how do you get beyond the black and white, right? Like our country has a very unique history with Native people. It has a very unique history with slavery and the African-American community. But how do you as a church get beyond, not beyond it where you don't deal with it, but how do you move into more segments of the community? Like the black-white binary will always be there, I think, because of our history, and it's relevant and it's important and we must deal with it. But sometimes what often happens, I think, when I'm reaching out to a Hispanic pastor, or I'm reaching out to a Native pastor, or to an Asian pastor, it feels to them like we're just saying the issues are black and white. And so for you, in your context, how do you move beyond that to the place where this is incorporating other ethnic groups, other languages in your particular context?
Yeah, I just have a few quick thoughts on it. I would say in some ways, KCC has been blessed in that just God's timing on some things. Like, we have folks show up to our church that had a real passion for the refugee community, years ago. So whether that was Bhutanese refugees, or refugees from Burma, or even when there were Congolese refugees, like that whole intentionality allowed people to begin to develop some cross-cultural experiences as they were trying to serve refugees from the time that they arrived at the airport to getting them enrolled in school and adjusted in the community. But that also was able to spark a conversation about the fact that, every African you encounter in our congregation didn't necessarily come originally as a refugee, right? And so there's a difference. And then it sparked conversations about the various layers of diversity within even the African community or the Latino community, like doing refugee ministries, for example, and creating like an African worship environment during that time. There was this reality that some of the folks who were in the community or in that worship experience back in their home nation, they would have been rivals, and here they were in the U.S. needing to find some unity, and the church was actually a great bridge for that. And so I would just say some of God's timing in that sparked good conversations, educating people on the fact that Africa is a continent with many nations, those sorts of things. I don't know that they would have come up otherwise. I think that one of the early steps we took, people can debate about whether it's good or not, was like having the African Children's Choir come in back in the day. Man, it was a much richer experience once we found that there were African children in our congregation that had a variety of gifts, that it's like we could put together our own African choir if we wanted to, made up of many different nations from Africa, without having to import, a group that's touring around the world. And then the other reality is for us, getting beyond the black and white issue, I would just say so much of it has to do with personal relationships on the part of the pastors and staff. If you begin to build relationships beyond just the black and white, you realize that there's so much more to learn, and it's such a richer experience, and prompts you to think about, should I be learning other languages or words from other languages? And then how do I help the congregation be able to do that? We've done things like diversity potlucks and those sorts of things where you can come and experience food from different cultures, and that sparks conversation. And then the other thing we did was we ended up launching a campus overseas in India, and just the caste system there, where we're talking about, hey, part of our vision that says reach all people, it can't just be a black and white issue, because that doesn't even apply in India. You know, it's a whole different issue, but it's the same conversation, the same kind of conversation. And so, you know, I will say this, the black and white issue may be the hardest one. And in our church, as we've gone down the road of becoming multi-ethnic, I'd say that the hardest group still, though, to engage, I found, has been African-American men, right? So we see a lot of interracial marriages that feel safe in our congregation. But like the young, you know, I would say the 20 to 30-year-old single African-American male, if they walk through the doors of our church, it still feels like a predominantly white church to them, even though it's much more diverse than it was before. And so we still got work to do there.
Well, hey, thank you, Kyle. I wish we had, man, we could talk about this for another hour, right? Just some of the conversations, some of the questions, and but unfortunately, we're out of time. What we will do is just give thanks to these amazing panelists. Thank you for volunteering your time and of your talent and your experience, just to be able to pour into our pastors and leaders. I know they are deeply appreciative. We are getting just messages from them now saying thank you for an amazing conversation, fruitful conversation, highlights of what has taken place. So thank you for being a part of this. And what I want to do is just to close this out, because we're already out of time, is invite Josemar just to pray for us and just kind of close this out. But thank you for tuning in. We are on again next week. Next week, we'll talk about homogeneous transitions again. However, next week we do it a little bit differently, where we'll actually have 3 churches that will share a little bit of their story, and they'll get free coaching. And so they'll share their story and get feedback from those who are watching. And so if we have actually one space that's still available, so if you have a church that is working to make this transition, or you're at the beginning stages of it and you'd like to get some free coaching and some free feedback, please let us know, and we'll try to include you in next week. But Josemar, would you close us out in Spanish? Feel free to do so, and close us out in prayer. Feel free to do so in Spanish. And thank you again. When she's done praying, we'll close out. But thank you so much for being a part of the webinar today.
Amado Padre Celestial, Señor, te damos gracias por este tiempo que tenemos para aprender. Te damos gracias, Señor, por cada panelista que estaba aquí. Gracias por todo lo que ellos nos traen, Señor, nos enseñan. Gracias por sus experiencias, Padre, y por las partes también que han sido malas, pero de donde ellos han aprendido, Señor. Gracias por cada persona que estuvo aquí con nosotros en el webinar el día de hoy, Señor. Te pido, Padre, por todas las iglesias, Señor, representadas el día de hoy, tanto las personas que hablaron como las personas que estuvieron viendo el video, Señor. Te pido, Padre, que nos ayudes, Señor, a unirnos, Padre, que no haya más división, Señor. Te pido, Padre, que ayudes a quebrar estas divisiones raciales, Padre. Te pido, Señor, que cada uno sintamos, Señor, el deseo y la necesidad de salir y hablar de ti, Señor. La gran comisión que nos diste, Padre, de hacer discípulos, Señor, a todas las naciones y a cada persona. Señor, que hagamos discípulos que sigan haciendo discípulos, Señor. Y que, Padre, que tu nombre, Señor, sea exaltado por cada persona, Señor, en cada nación, de cada tipo de raza, Señor, sin importar colores, Padre. Te pido, Señor, que seas tú con cada persona que está aquí. Dale fuerza, Señor, y dale ánimo y energía, Señor, para seguir dando, Señor, todo lo que ellos tienen para honrarte a ti, Señor. Te pido que seas tú con nosotros y ayudes a multiplicarnos, Señor. Te amamos, Señor, y te damos toda la gloria. Amén.
Amen. Amen. God bless you guys. We want to continue to have you celebrate every time a disciple makes a disciple, and every time a church multiplies itself. to the Wesleyan Church has a transforming presence in every zip code. We'll see you next time. God bless.